Stephen Colbert has signed off from The Late Show, CBS cancelling the programme in what it says was a purely financial decision, and the programme bowed out with an all-star cast.
On the 21st of May, 2026, Stephen Colbert.
On the night of May 21st, 2026, the lights inside the Ed Sullivan Theater burned one final time for The Late Show. For 11 seasons, that stage had belonged to Stephen Colbert. Now it didn't belong to anyone. CBS had already decided, almost a year earlier, that once Colbert walked off, nobody would walk on in his place. Not a new host, not a rebrand, nothing. The most-watched show in American late night was simply going to stop existing, and the network wanted the world to believe that decision had nothing to do with politics, nothing to do with power, and everything to do with a spreadsheet. This video is about why almost nobody who actually worked in that industry believed them. Before we get into the finale itself, it's worth remembering how unlikely Colbert's entire tenure at that desk actually was. For 9 years, he had built his career playing a satirical, blowhard version of a cable news pundit on The Colbert Report, a character so fully realized that plenty of viewers genuinely mistook the performance for the man himself. When Letterman announced his own retirement and CBS turned to Colbert as a successor, the assignment required something the character had never demanded of him: showing up as himself, night after night, with no persona to hide behind. That's a bigger leap than it might sound like from the outside, and Colbert has said publicly that the transition unsettled him more than people realized at the time. He took over in September 2015, inherited a franchise with more than 2 decades of history behind it, and spent his first couple of years finding his footing in the ratings. Then came the 2016 election cycle, and Colbert's version of the show, sharper, more overtly political, more willing to editorialize about the news of the day, started pulling ahead of the competition and never really gave up that lead. By the time this story reaches its ending, that lead had held for 9 consecutive seasons, longer than any previous host in the franchise's history had managed. Understanding that context matters, because it means the show wasn't canceled during a slump. It was canceled at the peak of its competitive run. Let's start where the story ends, because the finale itself tells you almost everything you need to know about how strange this whole saga really was. CBS never confirmed a headline guest in advance. No press release, no teaser trailer, nothing. That kind of silence is almost unheard of for the final episode of a decades-old institution. So the internet did what it always does: it guessed. Some people expected Barack Obama, who had appeared on the show multiple times over the years. Others held out hope for Pope Leo XIV, since Colbert, a devout Catholic, had openly said on Seth Meyers' show that the Pope was his dream guest for the final season. That appearance never happened, and Colbert leaned into the disappointment as a running joke, telling his audience the Pope had backed out over a dressing room dispute involving hot dogs. What the audience got instead unfolded like an ambush of affection. Throughout the broadcast, actors and comedians who had nothing to do with the official guest list kept interrupting from the crowd, each one pretending they deserved to be the last person Colbert ever interviewed. Bryan Cranston stood up. So did Paul Rudd, Ryan Reynolds, Tim Meadows, and Tig Notaro. It played as chaos, but underneath the jokes there was something more sincere happening. An entire generation of comedic talent showing up, uninvited, just to be present for the end of something they clearly considered important. Then the actual guest walked out, and it turned out to be worth the wait. Paul McCartney sat down across from Colbert for what would be the final couch interview in the history of the franchise. The symbolism practically wrote itself. The Ed Sullivan Theater is the exact room where the Beatles made their American television debut on February 9, 1964, a broadcast that reshaped the trajectory of popular music. More than 60 years later, one of the 2 surviving Beatles was sitting in that same building, talking with the man who was about to close the venue's chapter as a nightly talk show home. McCartney presented Colbert with a framed photograph from that original 1964 appearance, and the 2 of them spent part of the interview simply talking about what it had been like to walk into America through that stage door for the first time. Later in the broadcast, McCartney returned to the stage with Elvis Costello and the show's band for a performance of Hello, Goodbye, a song title that needed no further explanation given the circumstances. It was, by any measure, a spectacular piece of television. It was also, underneath all the celebration, a funeral with better production values and everyone in the room seemed to know it. Colbert himself seemed determined not to let the broadcast tip too far into bitterness. Rather than turning his final monologue into a farewell address about politics or grievance, he kept the tone unusually light for a show that had built its reputation on pointed commentary, joking about small, almost trivial things like potholes on an airport runway. It read, deliberately, like a man choosing to walk out the door on his own terms rather than the network's, refusing to let the final impression of his 11 years be one of anger. That restraint didn't erase the loaded moments elsewhere in the broadcast, but it did shape how the evening was remembered, less as a protest and more as a genuine goodbye. To understand why that funeral was necessary at all, you have to rewind almost a full year back to the summer of 2025 and pay very close attention to the calendar. On July 1st, 2025, Paramount, the parent company that owns CBS, agreed to pay Donald Trump $16 million to settle a lawsuit connected to a 60 Minutes interview with Kamala Harris. Trump had argued the interview had been deceptively edited. Paramount's own attorneys had reportedly told the company the case had little legal merit. The settlement landed at an especially sensitive moment, because Paramount was simultaneously seeking federal approval for its merger with Skydance Media, a deal that required a green light from Trump-appointed regulators at the FCC. Writing a $16 million check to a sitting president while your company needs a favor from his administration is the kind of coincidence that draws attention even when nobody intends it to. It helps to understand exactly why that merger made the settlement look so suspicious to so many people. Skydance's acquisition of Paramount was a multi-billion-dollar transaction, and like any deal of that size involving a broadcast license holder, it needed sign-off from the Federal Communications Commission, an agency whose leadership answers to the sitting president. Paramount was, in effect, asking the Trump administration for permission to close a deal worth billions of dollars at almost the exact same moment it was cutting Trump a personal settlement check over a lawsuit its own legal team reportedly considered weak. Nobody at Paramount ever publicly connected those two facts. They didn't have to. The calendar did it for them. Stephen Colbert did not let the moment pass quietly. On his broadcast just 2 weeks later, he addressed the settlement directly, telling his audience exactly what a large portion of the public was already thinking, that the payment looked less like a legal resolution and more like an attempt to smooth the path for a business deal. He didn't dance around the implication. He said it plainly on air to millions of viewers. 3 days after that broadcast, CBS announced it was canceling The Late Show entirely, with no successor and no replacement format, effective at the end of the 2025 to 2026 season. CBS's official explanation was that the cancellation was, in the network's own words, purely a financial decision against a challenging backdrop in late night, and that it was not related in any way to the show's performance, content, or other matters happening at Paramount. Executives framed it as an inevitable casualty of a declining format. And to be fair, they weren't inventing that backdrop out of nothing. Late night as a genre really has been shrinking for years, as younger viewers migrate towards streaming and short-form clips instead of watching live at 11:35. NBC had already trimmed Jimmy Fallon's taping schedule. Seth Meyers lost his house band to budget cuts. CBS itself had already canceled its own companion program, After Midnight, months earlier. So the claim wasn't absurd on its face. It just happened to arrive 3 days after the host publicly embarrassed the company's parent corporation over a payment to the President of the United States. That timing is precisely what a number of lawmakers couldn't let go of. Senator Elizabeth Warren said publicly that Americans deserved to know whether political pressure had played a role in ending the show. Senator Adam Schiff said much the same thing, arguing that if politics were involved, the public deserved to be told. Senator Bernie Sanders was even more direct, posting that he didn't believe the timing was a coincidence at all. Trump, for his part, made no effort to distance himself from the moment. He celebrated the cancellation publicly, saying he was glad Colbert had lost his job. Colbert responded on air that same week with one of the most replayed monologues of his career, reading Trump's comments back to the camera and firing back with a line about needing real writing talent to produce material as ridiculous as what he was quoting. Not everyone in the political world agreed there was a conspiracy. Commentator Keith Olbermann pushed back on the idea that this was a purely political hit job, pointing out that if CBS had wanted Colbert gone immediately for political reasons, they wouldn't have let the show keep running for another 10 months. It's a fair point, and worth including here rather than pretending the story is one-sided. But even that argument only addresses the timing of Colbert's exit, not the underlying question of why the network chose to retire an enormously popular, Emmy-winning program instead of simply replacing its host, or why it chose this particular week to make the announcement at all. And enormously popular is not an exaggeration. This wasn't a struggling show quietly bleeding viewers. The Late Show had been the #1 program in late night for 9 consecutive seasons, a run longer than any previous era of the franchise, including the Letterman years. In the second quarter of 2025, the show was pulling in more than 2 million viewers across dozens of new episodes and capturing roughly 9% of the available audience in its time slot, numbers that were still ahead of every direct competitor. During its final stretch on air, the show pulled in nearly 3 million viewers for a reunion special, one of its biggest single-night audiences in years. Then, 2 months after CBS announced the cancellation, Colbert and his writing team won the Emmy for Outstanding Talk Series, the first time a broadcast late-night show had ever taken that particular award. In other words, CBS was canceling a program that was simultaneously winning industry recognition and outperforming its rivals. That combination is what made the purely financial explanation so hard for people inside the business to accept. Jimmy Kimmel, a direct competitor who had every incentive to stay neutral, publicly dismissed CBS's cited financial losses as close to nonsensical, arguing the figures ignored the affiliate fees that local CBS stations were still collecting because of the show. That distinction matters more than it might seem. Late-night programs have historically generated revenue for a broadcast network in 2 separate ways: through the ad slots the network itself sells during the show, and through fees that local affiliate stations pay to carry network programming in their market. Critics of CBS's accounting argued that when the network cited a large annual loss tied to production costs, it was measuring only one side of that ledger. If a show is still a ratings leader still driving real value to affiliates around the country, calling it a straightforward money loser starts to look like a selective reading of the numbers rather than an objective one. Nobody said it with more bluntness than David Letterman, the man who built the modern version of this franchise after CBS lured him away from NBC back in 1993. In an interview with the New York Times, Letterman was asked directly about CBS's financial explanation, and he didn't hedge. He said he was going on record calling the network's executives liars, describing them, in his own words, as lying weasels. Letterman didn't stop at the interview. He showed up in person during Colbert's final week, joining him on the roof of the Ed Sullivan Theater to hurl old set furniture down onto a giant CBS logo painted below, a callback to one of Letterman's own signature stunts from decades earlier. At the end of the segment, Letterman looked into the camera and closed with a reference to legendary broadcaster Edward R. Murrow's famous sign-off, adding a much less broadcast-friendly word at the end that made the moment go viral for reasons beyond nostalgia. The industry's response wasn't limited to jabs at CBS. It also took the form of open solidarity. 10 days before Letterman's rooftop stunt, all 5 members of a group called Strike Force 5 reunited on Colbert's stage. That group, Colbert, Jimmy Fallon, Jimmy Kimmel, Seth Meyers, and John Oliver, had formed during the 2023 writers' strike, when all 5 hosts lost their shows simultaneously and started checking in on each other through regular calls. Those calls eventually became a podcast that raised money for out-of-work staff. When the 5 of them reunited on Colbert's stage near the end of his run, John Oliver didn't mince words about the cancellation, dismissing it in blunt terms as an unnecessary insult to the show's legacy. Jimmy Fallon, meanwhile, offered a quieter, more personal reflection, saying that growing up, he never thought of hosting a late-night show as a job in the traditional sense. It just felt like something that came with the television set, the way Johnny Carson always had. On the night of the actual finale, both Fallon and Kimmel aired reruns of their own programs, so they could physically sit in Colbert's studio audience and watch him sign off in person. A gesture that, according to people who cover the industry closely, had never happened before between competing hosts on air at the same time. While Colbert's peers were showing up to honor him, CBS had already made its next move, and that move told you almost everything about the network's real priorities. Starting the day after the finale, the network began filling the 11:35 time slot with Comics Unleashed, a long-running syndicated stand-up showcase hosted by Byron Allen. Allen is a notable figure in his own right. He got his start performing stand-up on The Tonight Show under Johnny Carson as a teenager and later built Allen Media Group into a media empire that includes the Weather Channel, a stake in Starz, and a majority interest in BuzzFeed. But the structure of this particular deal is what matters here. Allen isn't being paid by CBS to produce a show. He's buying the time slot outright and selling his own advertising within it. CBS spends essentially nothing to fill the hour. Industry estimates suggest this arrangement saves the network well over $100 million a year compared to producing an original talk show with a full writing staff, band, and production crew. That detail reframes the entire financial decision defense. CBS wasn't canceling Colbert because the show was failing. It was canceling him because doing nothing at all had become cheaper than doing something genuinely great. Letterman summarized the swap from Colbert to Allen in 5 blunt words. The network simply didn't want to spend money anymore. Interestingly, this wasn't framed as a personal rivalry between the two hosts. Colbert and Allen reportedly had breakfast together on the morning of the Emmy Awards in September 2025 and spent hours talking about their shared love of comedy and Carson's legacy. When the arrangement became official, Colbert reportedly sent Allen a congratulatory message, joking wistfully about wishing they could somehow tell Carson himself what had happened to the time slot he once occupied. It's worth pausing on the building itself, because the Ed Sullivan Theater isn't just a set. It's one of the most historically significant rooms in American entertainment. Constructed in 1927 by Arthur Hammerstein as a tribute to his father, the opera figure Oscar Hammerstein I, the theater was designed in a Gothic style with elaborate stained glass and a hidden central dome. Elvis Presley performed there. The Beatles made their American debut there in 1964, a broadcast so massive that CBS reportedly had to manage crowds outside the building for days beforehand. Ed Sullivan hosted his namesake variety program from that stage for 2 decades, turning it into one of the most reliable launching pads for new musical acts in the country. CBS purchased the building in January 1993, and Letterman turned it into the modern home of network late night when he brought his show over from NBC that same year, a role the building held continuously, night after night, until Colbert's final broadcast more than 3 decades later. In other words, this wasn't just the end of one man's show. It was the end of the building's 33-year run as a nightly talk show home altogether, a fact CBS acknowledged even in its own official statement announcing the cancellation, when it said the network would be retiring the Late Show franchise entirely rather than handing it to a new host. Because the building is a protected landmark, it legally has to remain a performance space of some kind. But as of the finale, CBS had not announced any future tenant. Colbert, who gave Architectural Digest a tour of the space shortly before signing off, said candidly that the idea of the theater sitting empty broke his heart, while adding that he hoped